People always ask me how I survived, how I made it through everything that happened to me. And honestly, I'm still figuring that out myself. But I guess if you're going to understand my story, you need to know that it all started when I was 8 years old, on what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday in March. I'm going to tell you about losing everything I ever loved in a single moment, about being thrown into a house where the people who were supposed to protect me became my worst nightmare, and about spending the next 10 years of my life fighting just to stay alive. This isn't some feel-good story where everything works out perfectly in the end. This is about what happens when a kid falls through every crack in the system, when the adults who are supposed to care about you see you as nothing more than a paycheck or a punching bag. But here's the thing, I'm still here. And that has to count for something, right? It was a Tuesday morning, and I remember because Mom always made pancakes on Tuesdays. She was standing at the stove in her yellow bathrobe, the one with the little flowers on it, humming some song I didn't recognize. Dad was already dressed for work, reading the newspaper and drinking his coffee from that ugly green mug I'd made him in art class. Everything was so normal, so perfect in that boring way that you don't appreciate until it's gone forever. "Alex, come eat before you miss the bus," Mom called out, not even turning around. She knew I was probably still in my pajamas, probably hadn't even brushed my teeth yet. She knew me too well. I can still smell those pancakes, sweet and buttery with just a hint of vanilla because Mom always added extra. I sat down at our little kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg that Dad kept saying he'd fix but never did, and watched my parents do their morning dance around each other. Dad would steal a piece of bacon from Mom's plate. She'd swat at him with her spatula, and they'd both laugh like it was the first time it had ever happened. "I'll pick you up after school today," Dad said, ruffling my hair as he grabbed his keys. "We can stop by the comic book store if you want." That was our thing. Every few weeks, Dad would take me to this little comic book store downtown, and I'd spend what felt like hours deciding which one to buy with my allowance money. He'd wait patiently, sometimes reading over my shoulder, sometimes just watching me with this smile on his face like I was the most interesting thing in the world. "Really? Can we get ice cream too?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We'll see," he said, which in Dad language meant absolutely yes. He kissed Mom goodbye, kissed the top of my head, and walked out the door. I had no idea it would be the last time I'd ever see him alive. The call came at 11:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I was in Mrs. Patterson's math class, staring at the clock and counting down the minutes until lunch, when the principal's voice came over the intercom. "Alex Morrison, please come to the office. Alex Morrison to the office, please." The whole class turned to look at me, and I felt my face get hot. I wasn't in trouble, at least I didn't think I was. But getting called to the principal's office was never a good thing. I grabbed my backpack and walked down the hallway on shaky legs, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Mrs. Henderson, our principal, was waiting for me with this woman I'd never seen before. She was wearing a dark blue suit and had this serious expression that made my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. "Alex, sweetheart, I need you to sit down," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "This is Ms. Rodriguez from Child Services." Child Services. Even at 8 years old, I knew that wasn't good. That meant something was wrong with my family, something bad enough that strangers had to get involved. "There's been an accident," Ms. Rodriguez said, and I swear I could hear my heart beating in my ears. "Your parents were in a car accident this morning. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them." The words didn't make sense at first. It was like she was speaking a foreign language, or like I was underwater and couldn't quite hear properly. Car accident. Drunk driver. These were things that happened to other people, not to my parents who made pancakes on Tuesday mornings and argued about who got the last piece of bacon. "Are they hurt?" I asked, even though something deep in my gut already knew the answer. Ms. Rodriguez looked at Mrs. Henderson, then back at me. "Alex, I'm so sorry. They didn't survive the accident. They're gone. Gone." Such a simple word for something so devastating. Gone like they'd stepped out to the store and would be right back. Gone like they were hiding somewhere and this was all just a really cruel game. But not gone like dead. Not gone like never coming home again. Not gone like I'd never hear Dad's laugh or smell Mom's perfume ever again. I don't remember much about the rest of that day. I know I cried, but it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I know Mrs. Henderson kept saying she was sorry, and Ms. Rodriguez kept asking me questions about relatives, about where I could stay, about things that seemed impossible to think about when my entire world had just collapsed. They told me I couldn't go home that night, something about the house needing to be sorted out and paperwork that had to be filed. Instead, I spent the night in a foster home with a family whose names I can't even remember now. They were nice enough, I guess, but everything felt wrong. The food tasted wrong, the bed felt wrong, even the air smelled wrong. I kept waiting for someone to tell me it was all a mistake, that my parents were actually fine, that they were looking for me, that this was all just some horrible mix-up that would be cleared up by morning. But morning came and nothing had changed. They were still gone and I was still alone. The funeral was 3 days later. I'd never been to a funeral before, and I had no idea what to expect. People kept coming up to me, people I'd never seen before, telling me how sorry they were, how much my parents loved me, how everything was going to be okay. But nothing felt okay. Nothing felt like it would ever be okay again. That's when I met my Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert for the first time. Well, not the first time ever. Apparently they'd been at some family gatherings when I was little, but the first time I really met them, really looked at them and realized that these strangers were about to become my family. Aunt Linda looked a little bit like my mom, but harder somehow. Where Mom's eyes were warm and kind, Aunt Linda's were cold and calculating. She wore too much makeup and her smile never quite reached her eyes. Uncle Robert was a big man with rough hands and a voice that seemed too loud for indoor spaces. He kept checking his phone during the funeral service, like he had somewhere better to be. "We'll take good care of you," Aunt Linda whispered to me after the service, squeezing my shoulder just a little too tight. "You're family now." But even at 8 years old, something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. There was something in her voice, something behind her eyes, that didn't match her words. It was like she was reading from a script, saying what she thought she was supposed to say. I didn't have a choice, though. Ms. Rodriguez explained that Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert were my closest relatives, that they'd agreed to take me in, that I was lucky to have family who wanted me. Lucky. That's the word she used. Lucky. As we drove away from the cemetery, away from my parents, away from everything I'd ever known, I pressed my face against the car window and watched my old life disappear behind me. I had no idea that I was driving toward something so much worse than grief, so much worse than being alone. I thought losing my parents was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I had no idea that it was just the beginning. The first thing I noticed about Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert's house was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, like Sunday mornings at home with Mom and Dad. This was a different kind of quiet, heavy and suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. Their house was bigger than ours had been, with fancy furniture and carpet so white I was afraid to walk on it. Everything looked expensive but cold, like a hotel room where nobody actually lived. There were no family photos on the walls, no drawings stuck to the refrigerator, no signs that anyone was actually happy there. "This is your room," Aunt Linda said, opening a door at the end of a long hallway. It was small and bare, with just a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the neighbor's fence. The walls were painted this dull beige color that made me feel sad just looking at it. "Where are my things?" I asked. I'd been carrying the same backpack for 3 days, wearing the same clothes I'd had on when Ms. Rodriguez picked me up from school. "We'll get you some new clothes tomorrow," she said, but her tone made it sound like a chore she didn't want to do. "Dinner's at 6. Don't be late." She left me alone in that empty room, and I sat on the edge of the bed, trying not to cry again. Everything smelled like cleaning products and air freshener, nothing like the warm, lived-in smell of my real home. I pulled out the only thing I had left from my old life, a small photo of my parents and me at the beach last summer. Dad was making a goofy face, Mom was laughing, and I was grinning with sand in my hair. Felt like looking at strangers. That first dinner was when I started to understand what my new life was going to be like. Uncle Robert barely looked at me, just shoveled food into his mouth while watching the TV in the living room. Aunt Linda kept staring at me like I was some kind of problem she needed to solve. "So, Alex," she said, cutting her chicken into tiny, precise pieces. "Robert and I have some rules in this house. We like things clean and quiet. Children should be seen and not heard, you understand?" I nodded, even though I didn't really understand at all. At home, dinner was when we talked about our days, when Dad would tell jokes and Mom would ask about school. Here, the only sound was the clinking of forks against plates and the TV droning on in the background. "You'll do chores to earn your keep," she continued. "Dishes, laundry, cleaning. We're not running a charity here. Earn my keep." Like I was some kind of burden they were doing a favor by letting me stay. Like they weren't getting money from the state for taking care of me. Because even at 8, I wasn't stupid. I'd heard Ms. Rodriguez talking about financial assistance and monthly payments. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines and unspoken rules. I learned that Uncle Robert drank beer every night after work, and that the more he drank, the meaner he got. I learned that Aunt Linda had a fake smile she put on whenever anyone else was around, but the second we were alone, her face would go cold and hard. I learned that I wasn't allowed to make noise in the mornings, wasn't allowed to leave my room after 8 p.m., wasn't allowed to touch the TV remote or eat anything without asking first. I learned that asking first usually meant being told no, so I started eating less, talking less, existing less. School became my escape. It was the only place where I could pretend to be normal, where nobody knew that I went home to a house that felt more like a prison. My teachers were nice enough, but they had their own classes to worry about, their own problems to deal with. And what was I supposed to tell them anyway? That my guardians were mean to me? That I felt unwanted? It wasn't like they were beating me or anything, and not yet. But I could feel something building. It was in the way Uncle Robert looked at me sometimes, like I was something he wanted to squash. It was in the way Aunt Linda's voice got sharper every day, like she was running out of patience for having me around. The first time Uncle Robert hit me was on a Saturday morning, about 2 months after I'd moved in. I'd been trying to reach a bowl from the top shelf to make myself some cereal, and I accidentally knocked over a glass. It shattered on the kitchen floor, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet house. What the hell was that? Uncle Robert's voice boomed from the living room, and I felt my stomach drop to my feet. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair messy from sleep, his eyes already angry. "I'm sorry," I stammered, dropping to my knees to pick up the pieces. "It was an accident. I'll clean it up." "Damn right you'll clean it up," he said, stepping closer. "Do you have any idea how much that glass cost?" "I'm sorry," I said again, because I didn't know what else to say. My hands were shaking as I tried to gather the broken pieces, and I could feel him looming over me, could smell the stale beer on his breath even though it was only 9 in the morning. "Sorry doesn't pay for a new glass," he said, and then his hand was in my hair, yanking me up off the floor. The broken glass scattered again, and I let out a yelp of pain as he dragged me to my feet. "Stop being such a crybaby," he said, and then he slapped me across the face, hard enough that I saw stars. The sound echoed through the kitchen, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I touched my cheek, feeling the sting and the heat, and looked up at him with what must have been pure shock on my face. At home, the worst punishment I'd ever gotten was being sent to my room without dessert. This was something else entirely. "Clean up this mess," he said, his voice lower now but somehow even more threatening. "And if you ever break anything in my house again, you'll get a lot worse than that." I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up every tiny piece of glass, my cheek throbbing and my hands still shaking. Aunt Linda came downstairs eventually, took one look at my red, swollen face, and didn't say a word. She just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table like nothing had happened. That's when I realized the truth that would define the next 10 years of my life. There was nobody coming to save me. No social worker was going to check up on me. No teacher was going to notice the bruises. No neighbor was going to care about the kid who never played outside. I was completely and utterly alone with these people who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience and a paycheck. The hitting got worse after that. Uncle Robert seemed to realize that he could get away with it, that I was too scared and too young to tell anyone. A slap for leaving a dish in the sink. A punch in the stomach for talking too loud. A shove that sent me sprawling across the floor for looking at him wrong. Aunt Linda never lifted a hand to stop him. Sometimes she'd even find excuses to leave the house when she knew he was in a bad mood, like she was giving him permission to take his anger out on me. Other times, she'd just sit there and watch, her face blank and indifferent, like she was watching TV instead of watching a grown man beat up a child. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was bad enough. The worst part was the way they made me feel like I deserved it, like I was such a burden and such a screw-up that this was somehow my fault. They never said it outright, but it was in every look, every sigh, every time they made me feel like I should be grateful they were putting up with me at all. By Christmas, I'd stopped expecting things to get better. I'd stopped hoping that someone would notice what was happening to me. I'd learned to flinch at sudden movements, to keep my head down and my mouth shut, to make myself as small and invisible as possible. But even then, even at my lowest point, I had no idea how much worse things were going to get. Because Uncle Robert's fists were just the beginning of my nightmare. The real horror was still waiting for me, hiding in the shadows like a monster I couldn't even imagine yet. I was about to learn that there are things so much worse than being beaten. Things that would make those early slaps seem like gentle corrections. Things that would change me in ways I'm still trying to understand. Even now, by the time I turned 9, I'd become an expert at reading the warning signs. The way Uncle Robert's jaw would clench when he walked through the door after work. The sound of his keys hitting the kitchen counter just a little too hard. The way Aunt Linda would suddenly find reasons to go upstairs or step outside when she sensed his mood shifting. I learned to make myself invisible during those moments, to slip away to my room and close the door as quietly as possible. But sometimes, no matter how careful I was, it wasn't enough. The beatings had become routine by then. Not daily, but regular enough that I always had bruises somewhere on my body. Uncle Robert was smart about it. He never hit me anywhere that would show when I was wearing regular clothes. Always the stomach, the back, the upper arms where my sleeves would cover the marks. Always places where a teacher wouldn't notice unless they were really looking. And let's be honest, who was really looking? I got good at lying about the pain. I fell off my bike, became my go-to excuse for limping. I ran into a door, explained away the occasional black eye that makeup couldn't quite cover. The school nurse would nod and make notes, but nobody ever asked the right questions. Nobody ever wondered why a 9-year-old was so clumsy, or why I never seemed to have any friends, or why I flinched every time an adult raised their voice. The worst part was how normal it all started to feel. I know that sounds crazy, but when you're living in that kind of situation day after day, your brain just adapts. You start to think that maybe this is how all families work, maybe all kids get hit when they mess up, maybe I really am as worthless as they keep telling me I am. School became my sanctuary, but even that wasn't safe for long. My grades started slipping because it's hard to concentrate on math when you're wondering if you're going to get beaten when you get home. I stopped participating in class discussions because I'd learned that speaking up usually led to trouble. I ate lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria because making friends felt impossible when you're carrying secrets that feel too big and too dark to share. Mrs. Patterson, my 4th grade teacher, tried to reach out a few times. She'd ask me to stay after class, would sit down at my desk level and ask how things were going at home. But what was I supposed to say? That my uncle punched me in the stomach yesterday because I forgot to take out the trash? That my aunt told me I was a burden and wished I'd never come to live with them? That sometimes I wished I'd died in that car accident with my parents because at least then I wouldn't have to live through this nightmare? Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson, I'd say, staring at my hands. I'm just tired. She'd look at me with these concerned eyes, and I could tell she wanted to push harder, wanted to ask more questions. But I'd learned to put up walls, to give just enough information to satisfy adults without revealing anything that might get me in worse trouble at home. Because that was the thing they never tell you about being abused. It's not just about the physical pain. It's about the constant fear, the walking on eggshells, the way your whole world shrinks down to just trying to survive each day without making things worse. It's about losing pieces of yourself bit by bit until you're not sure who you used to be before all of this started. The emotional abuse was almost worse than the physical stuff, if that makes sense. Uncle Robert had this way of looking at me like I was nothing, like I was less than human. He'd call me names that made me feel small and worthless. Waste of space, little freak, burden. But he'd say it in this casual way, like he was just stating facts about the weather. Aunt Linda was more subtle but just as cruel. She had this way of sighing whenever I walked into a room, like my very presence was exhausting to her. She'd compare me to other kids, telling me how much better behaved they were, how much less trouble they caused their families. She'd forget to buy me school supplies or new clothes when I outgrew the old ones, then act like I was being ungrateful when I asked, "Do you think money grows on trees?" She'd snap, "We're already doing more than enough for you." The isolation was killing me slowly. I felt like I was disappearing, becoming this ghost of a kid who just floated through each day without really living. I stopped laughing, stopped smiling unless I absolutely had to for appearances. I stopped hoping for things to get better because hope hurt too much when it got crushed over and over again. But then something happened that changed everything, that made me realize I had to find a way to fight back or I wasn't going to survive. It was a Tuesday night in February, and I'd made the mistake of asking if I could join the school's after-school art program. I'd seen the flyer on the bulletin board, and for just a moment, I'd let myself imagine what it would be like to stay after school, to work on projects, to maybe even make a friend or two. Art program? Uncle Robert laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. What kind of pansy wants to do art? You think we're raising some kind of fairy? It's just after school, I said quietly. I wouldn't need any supplies or anything. They have everything there. Oh, so now you're making demands? His voice got that dangerous edge that I knew meant trouble. You think you get to decide how you spend your time around here? I should have backed down then. I should have said never mind and slipped away to my room. But something in me, some tiny spark of the kid I used to be before all this started, made me try one more time. I just thought it might be fun, I whispered. That's when he exploded. Not just yelling, not just one of his usual slaps or punches. He grabbed me by the shirt and shook me so hard my teeth rattled, screaming about ungrateful kids and knowing my place and how dare I ask for anything when they were already doing so much for me. But the worst part was what happened next. He dragged me to the kitchen and opened the drawer where they kept the wooden spoons. I'd seen him grab them before when he was really angry, but he'd never actually used one on me. Until that night. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Sharp and burning and so intense that I couldn't even scream. I just bit my lip until I tasted blood and tried not to pass out. He hit me across the back, across my legs, anywhere he could reach while I curled up on the kitchen floor trying to protect myself. Maybe this will teach you not to ask for things you don't deserve, he panted, finally stopping when his arm got tired. I lay there on the cold linoleum for a long time after he left, listening to the TV in the living room, listening to Aunt Linda washing dishes like nothing had happened. Every part of my body hurt, but the worst pain was in my chest, in the place where hope used to live. That night, lying in my bed with welts across my back that made it impossible to get comfortable, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that this was normal, that this was what I deserved. I had to find a way out, even if I had no idea how. I was 9 years old, and I was already planning my escape from hell. The only problem was, I had no idea that Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda weren't done with me yet. I had no idea that there were depths of cruelty I hadn't even imagined, horrors waiting for me that would make everything I'd already endured seem like a warm-up. The real nightmare was just beginning, and I was about to learn that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from most. I want to warn you that this part of my story gets really dark. I've thought about leaving some things out, about making it easier to hear, but I think people need to know what really happens behind closed doors. They need to understand how bad things can get when nobody's watching. I was 11 when Uncle Robert's behavior toward me changed in a way that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. The beatings had become so routine that I'd almost gotten used to them, if you can believe that. But then something shifted, and suddenly I was dealing with a nightmare I didn't even have words for. It started with looks. These long, uncomfortable stares when he thought nobody was watching. He'd watch me eat dinner, watch me do homework at the kitchen table, watch me in ways that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't explain why. I'd catch him looking at me and he'd smile this slow, creepy smile that made me want to run and hide. Then came the comments. Little things at first, remarks about how I was growing up and developing. comments about my body that made me feel dirty and confused. I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was happening, but some instinct deep inside me knew it was wrong. Aunt Linda was working more hours at her job, which meant more time alone in the house with Uncle Robert. She'd leave in the morning and sometimes not come back until after dinner, leaving me to fend for myself with a man who was becoming more dangerous every day. The first time he touched me inappropriately, I froze completely. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when he came up behind me and put his hands on my shoulders. Not unusual in itself, but then his hands started moving, touching places they had no business touching. "This is our little secret," he whispered in my ear, his breath hot and disgusting against my neck. "You understand? Nobody would believe you anyway." I ran to my room and locked the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I sat on my bed, shaking and trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew it was wrong. Knew it was the kind of thing adults had warned us about in those awkward school assemblies about stranger danger. But this wasn't a stranger. This was my guardian, the man who was supposed to be taking care of me. The worst part was that he was right. Who would believe me? I was just some damaged kid with dead parents and a reputation for being difficult. He was a respected member of the community, someone who went to church on Sundays and coached Little League on weekends. If I told anyone what was happening, they'd think I was making it up, that I was just trying to get attention or cause trouble. The incidents got worse and more frequent. He'd corner me when Aunt Linda wasn't around, would make me do things that still make me sick to think about. And every time, he'd remind me that it was our secret, that bad things would happen to me if I ever told anyone. "You think this foster system is bad?" he'd say afterward, zipping up his pants while I sat there trying not to vomit. "You have no idea what those places are really like. Keep your mouth shut, or you'll find out." I started spending every possible moment away from the house. I'd stay at school as late as they'd let me, volunteering to help teachers clean their classrooms or organize supplies. I'd hide in the public library until closing time, pretending to do homework while really just trying to delay going home. I'd take long walks around the neighborhood, not caring if I got in trouble for being late to dinner. But I always had to go back eventually, and he was always waiting. The physical abuse didn't stop during this time. If anything, it got worse. Now Uncle Robert had even more power over me, more ways to keep me quiet and compliant. He'd beat me for looking at him wrong or acting like a little slut, which was his favorite new insult. The bruises layered on top of each other until my body was a map of pain and humiliation. I stopped eating regularly because my stomach was constantly churning with anxiety and disgust. I stopped sleeping well because I'd lie awake listening for his footsteps in the hallway, terrified that tonight would be the night he decided to come into my room. I started having panic attacks, though I didn't know that's what they were at the time. I just knew that sometimes I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but shake and cry. School became even more of a struggle. My grades plummeted because I couldn't concentrate on anything except surviving each day. Teachers would ask what was wrong, and I'd make up excuses about not feeling well or having trouble sleeping. Some of them looked at me with concern, but nobody pushed hard enough to break through the walls I'd built around myself. The isolation was complete now. I felt like I was living in a different world from everyone else. A dark, twisted world where the worst things you could imagine were just normal parts of daily life. I'd watch other kids laughing with their friends or complaining about their parents' rules, and I'd feel this crushing loneliness because I couldn't remember what it felt like to have problems that normal. I started thinking about death a lot during this time, not in a dramatic way, but in this quiet, desperate way where I'd wonder if maybe everyone would be better off if I just wasn't around anymore. I'd think about my parents and wonder if they were disappointed in me, if they could see what was happening and were ashamed of how weak I'd become. But then something happened that changed everything. Something that gave me the strength to start fighting back, even though I didn't know how. It was a Thursday afternoon in October, and I was in the bathroom at school when I overheard two teachers talking in the hallway. They were discussing another student, a girl named Katie whose parents had been arrested for child abuse. "Thank God someone finally reported it," one of them said. "That poor child has been suffering for years. I just wish she'd felt safe enough to tell someone sooner," the other replied. Kids need to know that adults will believe them, that there are people who will help. I stood there in that bathroom stall, listening to their voices fade as they walked away, and something clicked in my brain. For the first time in months, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe there were adults who would believe me. Maybe there was a way out of this nightmare. That night, lying in bed with fresh bruises on my ribs and trying to forget what Uncle Robert had done to me earlier, I made a plan. I was going to tell someone. I didn't know who yet, or how, or what would happen afterward, but I couldn't keep living like this. I was 12 years old, and I'd already endured more than any child should ever have to face. I had no idea that my plan to escape would nearly get me killed. I had no idea that Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda had their own plans for keeping me quiet permanently. I was about to learn that sometimes fighting back makes things worse before they get better. But for the first time in years, I had hope. And sometimes, hope is the most dangerous thing of all. The decision to tell someone about what was happening to me was both the bravest and most terrifying thing I'd ever done. For weeks after overhearing those teachers, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain years of abuse to someone who had no idea what my life was really like. I chose Mrs. Rodriguez, my 7th grade English teacher. She was young, maybe late 20s, and she had this way of really listening when students talked to her. She'd never made me feel stupid for struggling with assignments, never acted annoyed when I asked to stay after class to finish work I couldn't concentrate on at home. Took me 3 tries to actually say the words. The first time, I stood outside her classroom door for 20 minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, before walking away. The second time, I made it inside and sat down across from her desk. But when she asked what I needed to talk about, I panicked and made up some story about having trouble with a writing assignment. The third time, on a rainy Tuesday in November, I finally found the courage. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something, but I don't know how." She looked up from the papers she was grading and gave me her full attention. "Take your time, Alex. Whatever it is, I'm here to listen." I stared at my hands, trying to find words for things I'd never said out loud. "My uncle, he hurts me. He's been hurting me for years. And it's not just hitting anymore. It's..." I couldn't finish the sentence, but something in my face must have told her what I meant. Her expression changed completely. The casual, after-school friendliness was replaced by something intense and focused. "Alex, are you telling me that your uncle has been physically and sexually abusing you?" I nodded, still not able to look at her directly. "And my aunt knows. She doesn't stop him. Sometimes I think she leaves the house on purpose so he can do things to me." Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, and I started to panic. Maybe she didn't believe me. Maybe she thought I was making it up. Maybe she was already figuring out how to get rid of me without causing trouble. "Alex, look at me," she said gently. When I finally met her eyes, they were filled with something I hadn't seen from an adult in years. Genuine concern and anger on my behalf. "I believe you. What's happening to you is not okay, and it's not your fault. We're going to get you help." Those words, "I believe you," hit me like a physical blow. I started crying, not the quiet, careful tears I'd learned to shed in silence, but huge, ugly sobs that came from somewhere deep inside me. Years of fear and shame and loneliness poured out of me right there in that classroom. Mrs. Rodriguez came around her desk and knelt beside my chair. She didn't try to hug me or touch me, which I was grateful for. I couldn't handle being touched by anyone right then. But she stayed close, talking to me in this calm, steady voice while I fell apart. "We're going to call Child Protective Services," she said. "I'm what's called a mandated reporter, which means I'm legally required to report suspected abuse. But more than that, Alex, you deserve to be safe. You deserve to be protected." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and interviews and forms to fill out. A social worker named Mr. Peterson came to the school, and I had to tell my story all over again, this time with more details, more specific dates and incidents. It was humiliating and exhausting, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in years, adults were taking me seriously, treating me like someone who mattered. "We're going to remove you from the home immediately," Mr. Peterson told me. "You won't have to go back there tonight." I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt terrified. Where would I go? What would happen to me now? Uncle Robert had been right about one thing. The foster system was unpredictable and often cruel. At least with him and Aunt Linda, I knew what to expect. This was jumping into complete unknown territory. They placed me in an emergency foster home that night with a family called the Johnsons. Mrs. Johnson was this soft-spoken woman with gray hair and kind eyes who showed me to a small but comfortable bedroom and told me I was safe now. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she said, bringing me a plate of homemade cookies and a glass of milk. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." I wanted to believe her, but I'd learned not to trust promises from adults. I spent that first night lying awake, listening for footsteps in the hallway, waiting for someone to come through the door and hurt me. It took weeks before I could sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. Meanwhile, the legal process moved forward. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda were arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, sexual assault, and neglect. I had to testify at hearings, had to sit in courtrooms and tell strangers the most private, painful details of my life. Their lawyer tried to paint me as a troubled kid who was making up stories for attention. He brought up my parents' death, suggesting that the trauma had made me delusional. He questioned every detail of my testimony, trying to find inconsistencies that would make me look like a liar. But the medical evidence backed up my story. Years of abuse had left marks on my body that couldn't be explained away. And other people started coming forward. Neighbors who had heard screaming from the house, teachers who had noticed changes in my behavior, even some of Uncle Robert's co-workers who said he'd made inappropriate comments about me. The hardest part was facing them in court. Uncle Robert sat there in his suit and tie, looking like a respectable member of society, glaring at me with pure hatred in his eyes. Aunt Linda cried and acted like she was the victim, like I was somehow destroying her life by telling the truth about what she'd allowed to happen to me. "You little liar," Uncle Robert hissed at me during a break in testimony. "You're going to regret this for the rest of your miserable life." But his threats didn't scare me anymore. I had something I'd never had before: adults who believed me, who were fighting for me, who saw me as someone worth protecting. Mrs. Rodriguez came to every hearing, sitting in the gallery so I'd have a friendly face to look at when things got too overwhelming. The Johnsons advocated for me with social services, making sure I got the therapy and support I needed. It took almost a year, but eventually Uncle Robert was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Aunt Linda got 5 years and a lifetime on the sex offender registry. It wasn't enough, nothing could ever be enough to make up for what they'd stolen from me. But it was justice of a sort. More importantly, I was free. 13 years old. After 5 years of hell, I was finally safe. The Johnsons asked if they could adopt me, if I wanted to become part of their family permanently. For the first time since my parents died, I had a real home again. But freedom isn't the same thing as healing. I had years of trauma to work through, years of damage to undo. I was angry and scared and broken in ways I didn't even understand yet. The real work, the work of learning to trust again, to believe I was worth something, to build a life worth living, was just beginning. Recovery isn't like what you see in movies. There's no magical moment where everything suddenly gets better. No inspiring montage where sad music plays while you work through your trauma and come out the other side completely healed. Real healing is messy and slow, and sometimes it feels like you're taking 10 steps backward for every step forward. Living with the Johnsons was the first stable, safe environment I'd had since my parents died. But that didn't mean it was easy. After years of abuse, I didn't know how to live in a normal family. I flinched when Mr. Johnson raised his voice, even when he was just cheering at a football game on TV. I hoarded food in my bedroom because I couldn't believe that meals would always be available when I was hungry. I had nightmares that woke up the whole house, panic attacks that came out of nowhere, and this constant anxiety that something terrible was about to happen. Mrs. Johnson was patient with me in ways I didn't deserve. When I broke down crying because she asked me to help with dishes, something that triggered memories of the chores Uncle Robert used to demand, she just sat with me until I could breathe again. When I refused to eat dinner for 3 days straight because my stomach was too twisted up with anxiety, she didn't force me or lecture me. She just left plates of food outside my bedroom door and told me she'd be there whenever I was ready to talk. The therapy was the hardest part. Dr. Martinez was this kind but no-nonsense woman who specialized in childhood trauma, and she didn't let me hide behind the walls I'd built up over the years. She made me talk about things I tried to bury so deep I almost convinced myself they hadn't happened. Healing means feeling everything you couldn't feel when you were trying to survive, she told me during one of our sessions. All that pain and anger and fear, it's still inside you, and it needs to come out. I fought her for months. I'd sit in her office and refuse to talk, or I'd lie and say I was fine, or I'd get so angry I'd storm out of sessions. But she never gave up on me. Week after week, she kept showing up, kept believing that I was worth the effort it would take to help me heal. High school was rough. By then, I was 15 and the Johnsons had officially adopted me, giving me their last name and a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. But I was still struggling with depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms that made it hard to concentrate or make friends. I was behind academically because of all the school I'd missed during the worst years of abuse. Social situations were nearly impossible because I didn't know how to relate to kids my age who hadn't been through what I'd been through. How do you make small talk with someone when your biggest concern is whether you'll have flashbacks during lunch period? But slowly, very slowly, things started to get better. I found my voice again in unexpected ways. I started writing, first just in journals that Dr. Martinez encouraged me to keep, then essays for English class that my teachers said were powerful and honest. Writing became my way of processing everything that had happened to me, of making sense of experiences that had felt senseless for so long. I also discovered that I wasn't alone. Through support groups for abuse survivors, I met other people who understood what I'd been through. There was something incredibly healing about sitting in a circle with other survivors and realizing that the shame and self-blame I carried weren't unique to me. We'd all been told we were worthless. We'd all been made to feel like the abuse was our fault. And we were all working to unlearn those lies. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when I was 17. I was in Dr. Martinez's office, talking about my plans for college, when she asked me something that stopped me cold. "Alex, when you think about your future, what do you see?" I realized I'd never really thought about having a future. For so many years, I'd been focused just on surviving each day that I'd never imagined there could be something beyond that. But sitting there in her office, for the first time in my life, I could picture myself as an adult. I could see myself going to college, having a career, maybe even having a family of my own someday. "I want to help other kids," I said, the words coming out before I'd even fully formed the thought. "Kids who are going through what I went through. I want them to know that someone believes them, that they're not alone." That conversation changed everything. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make up for the years of education I'd lost to trauma. I graduated high school with decent grades and got accepted to a state university where I majored in social work. It wasn't easy. I still had bad days, still struggled with anxiety and depression, but I had a purpose now, something bigger than just surviving. In college, I started speaking at awareness events about child abuse. The first time I told my story to a room full of strangers, I was terrified. My hands shook, my voice cracked, and I had to stop several times to compose myself. But when I finished, a young woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you. I needed to hear that I wasn't the only one." That's when I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I'm 25 now, and I work as a victim advocate for children in the foster care system. Every day, I meet kids who remind me of myself at 8, at 10, at 12, scared, hurt, convinced that nobody will believe them or care enough to help. I get to be the adult I needed when I was their age, the person who says, "I believe you," and means it. The nightmares don't come as often anymore, though they still visit sometimes. I've been in therapy on and off for over a decade, and I've learned that healing isn't a destination you reach. It's an ongoing journey. Some days are harder than others. Some anniversaries or triggers can still knock me flat. But I have tools now and support systems, and most importantly, I have hope. I think about my parents a lot, especially when I'm working with kids who've lost everything like I did. I wonder what they would think of who I've become, whether they'd be proud of how I turned their greatest tragedy into something that helps others. I think they would be. The Johnsons are still in my life, They're my real family now, the people who taught me what love without conditions looks like. Mrs. Johnson walked me down the aisle when I got married last year to a woman who knows my whole story and loves me not in spite of it, but including it. Mrs. Johnson cried when I called to tell her we're expecting our first child. Sometimes people ask me how I did it, how I survived everything that happened to me and came out the other side. The truth is, I almost didn't. There were times when the pain felt like too much, when I didn't think I was strong enough to keep going. But I had people who refused to give up on me. Mrs. Rodriguez, the Johnsons, Dr. Martinez, and eventually myself. If you're listening to this and you're going through something similar, please know that you're not alone. It might not feel like it right now, but there are people who will believe you, who will fight for you, who will help you find your way back to yourself. Your story doesn't end with what happened to you. It's just the beginning of who you're going to become. The scars are still there, and they always will be. But they're not the whole story anymore. They're just part of it, part of the journey that led me to exactly where I needed to be. And sometimes that has to be enough.